Doctors and nurses, what's the most craziest self-inflicted intimate injuries that patients tried to pass off as completely innocent? Story 1. Not a doctor, but I worked briefly as a healthcare assistant in an emergency admissions unit when I was about 18. Very little training, mostly just figuring things out on the job. The unit was pretty small, mostly filled with people recovering from surgeries, falls, or fights. It was usually a pretty tame gig. Until one night, a middle-aged man gets wheeled in by paramedics, looking super uncomfortable. We're completely full, so he's asked to wait in the chair until a bed opens up. Shouldn't have been too long, but then delays happen, and hours go by. Poor guy's still sitting there, shifting around and looking more and more miserable. Then a different paramedic team comes in with another patient. One of them spots this guy still in the chair, bursts out laughing and says something like, "You guys really left him like that?" We're confused until the nurse in charge checks his notes, immediately goes wide-eyed and starts laughing too. Turns out this gentleman had a vibrating egg lodged in his back door, and it was still turned on. We finally get him into a bed, and shortly after, I'm standing next to a junior doctor, only a few years older than me, who's now tasked with trying to retrieve it. We're all looking at the x-ray where, yep, there it is, a little blurry oval, courtesy of the vibration mid-scan. As the doctor's working on removing it, the patient, totally deadpan, says, "You know, people usually pay good money for this kind of service." Absolutely lost it. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. Not a doctor, but a friend of mine ended up being that guy at the ER. So he and his wife were trying something adventurous. He decided to do a headstand while she gave him a blowy, spice things up a little. Now the twist is, he used to be a gymnast, years ago, keywords used to be. So in his mind this was no big deal. At first it was all going great, until his core strength gave out. Instead of bailing, he tried to hold the pose, and ended up crashing down and spraining his neck mid-BJ. When he got to the ER, did he admit the truth? Absolutely not. He told the staff he tripped over a laundry basket. Sure, buddy. Laundry basket sprain now has a very different meaning in that ER. Story 3. This one's from my wife. She's a nurse, and back in her second year working the ER, she had a night she'll never forget. So this Hell's Angel biker, full leathers, beard, the whole 9 yards, pulls up on his chopper right to the hospital doors. He walks in like he owns the place, and tells the front desk he's got a little problem. Naturally, my wife asks what kind of problem. He leans in and says, with a straight face, "I've got a vibrator stuck up my back door and it's still on." So she calmly walks him to the ER room, but here's the kicker. It's a small hospital, and the doctor had already gone home. That meant she and the staff were left to handle it. She said the thing was buzzing like a power drill, and they fought to get it out for over 30 minutes. Eventually, they had to break out the speculum to finish the job. Once they got it out, this dude didn't even blink, just got back on his motorcycle and rode off into the night like a legend. Say what you will, but the Hells Angels are tough SOBs. Story 4. Back when I was working as an orderly in the ER during university, we had a patient come in, wrapped in nothing but a blanket, a sweater, and shoes. Already a weird look, right? He walks in calmly and explains that he has a vacuum cleaner hose stuck on his junk. Yep, fully attached. Still on there. When asked what happened, he gives us the most straight-faced explanation I've ever heard. Apparently he suffers from severe dust allergies and said he was instructed to clean his house completely bare to avoid triggering a reaction. Science. Mid-cleaning, he says, he became inexplicably fatigued and decided to take a nap while leaving the vacuum on. According to him, sometime during that innocent nap, his equipment must have accidentally flopped into the running vacuum hose, and that's when the suction, locked on. Also, just for the record, he insisted his arousal was entirely involuntary. We ended up having to use a surgical rotary saw to cut the vacuum hose off. Still one of the most creative excuses I've ever heard for what was very obviously a solo science experiment gone wrong. Story 5. This one wasn't exactly an injury, but it was definitely one of the strangest cases of intentional weirdness I ever saw working in the ER. A guy walks into the emergency room and says, with a completely straight face, that he has a stick lodged in his urethra. His explanation? He shoved it in there to help keep things hard and then, oops, lost it. So begins what can only be described as a parade of professionals trying to verify this. He gets examined by multiple staff members, and then it's my job to x-ray his pelvis and, other areas. Nothing. No sign of the stick. Still trying to be thorough, the doc orders an ultrasound of his bladder, and again his manhood. Also nothing. Eventually the doctor says, well, if he can pee, he's probably fine to go, and sends a nurse in to collect a urine sample. Here is where it gets ridiculous. The guy hands the sample cup back, and floating in the urine is a stick. But not a believable stick. Not something small or straight. This was awkwardly shaped, way too large to have ever been up there, and definitely not the kind of thing that just falls out during a casual pee. Conclusion? The man faked the entire thing, just to get a handful of medical professionals to handle his junk for most of the evening. We were basically catfished by someone's weird fantasy. Story 6. Not a medical professional, but I was the patient in this case, and I actually had the opposite experience. A completely innocent injury that every doctor was convinced had to be something weird. At the time, I was working from home and living the ultra-casual life. Think pajama pants 24/7s. The kind with the loose front fly that doesn't really close, just sort of folds. One day I decided to make hot dogs for lunch. I pull them out of the toaster oven. They're piping hot, covered in grease. I take one bite, and suddenly the hot dog launches itself out of the bun like a missile. Where does it land? Direct hit, right through the fly of my pajama pants. Let's just say I was immediately in serious pain. Burned in a place no one ever wants to be burned. I ended up at the ER, sitting in the waiting room with my bits tucked into a cup of ice water like it was a cocktail garnish. The doctor finally sees me, asks what happened. I tell him the hot dog story, completely embarrassed. He just looks at me and says, "Son, it's okay. You don't have to lie to me." He was convinced it was some kind of freak accident involving a food fantasy or something. I kept insisting it was just lunch gone wrong, but I don't think he ever believed me. Gave me some cream, told me to apply it carefully, and sent me on my way. Still probably the most mortifyingly innocent injury I'll ever have. Story 7. So a guy came into the ER asking to be tested for STDs. Naturally, I asked him what happened. He said he had pulled over behind a gas station to relieve himself, and just as he finished, someone jumped out of the bushes and gave him a quick kiss on his dong. Not the kind of roadside service he was expecting. Story 8. One of my all-time favorites came from a very polite, elderly couple who walked into the ER one night. The husband was clearly uncomfortable, sweating, wincing, shifting in his seat, but absolutely refused to say what was wrong while his wife was within earshot. Once we got him into a room and she stepped out, he finally opened up. Turns out, he had a plastic Easter egg lodged way up where eggs don't normally go. When we asked how it happened, he didn't miss a beat. He just sighed and said, "I wanted to know what it's like to be a chicken." Story 9. Okay, this happened to me, and it was a bit of an embarrassing mix-up at the dermatologist's office. I started getting a strange rash on my hands and face. At first, I thought it was just an allergy, but it didn't go away, so I made an appointment with the dermatologist. The nurse looked at it and immediately said, "Oh, this looks like poison ivy." Now I was confused because I hadn't been outside much. I'm a college student who works retail. No hiking, no nature adventures. So I told her I had no idea how it happened. The nurse gave me this look, you know, the one that says, "Come on, I know you're hiding something." She asked me if I was sure, kind of implying that I must have been doing something I shouldn't have been in the woods. She practically accused me of getting poison ivy from some shady outdoor adventure and said I should be honest about it. I kept insisting that I had no idea, and she rolled her eyes and stormed out to get the doctor. It wasn't until I got home and thought about it that I realized if I had been messing around in the woods, I'd have at least come up with a better excuse. I'd have had to explain it to my doctor, and probably even to my parents when I had to ask them for insurance info. I mean, seriously, there's got to be a less suspicious way to get poison ivy, right? Story 10. This one is an exactly intimate injury, but it was one of the most unforgettable cases from med school. And yeah, it started with a simple complaint. She smells. We were doing our OB/gyno rotation, and a young woman was referred from the psychiatric unit to us. The official reason? A persistent, overwhelming odor that hadn't responded to anything. They'd tried showers, clean clothes, everything. Nothing worked. We were confused at first, until she was wheeled into the exam room, and immediately the smell hit us like a wall. No exaggeration, half the group had to step out of the room. The paramedics who brought her in said they'd driven the whole way with the ambulance windows down. We get her into stirrups for a pelvic exam, and what we found still haunts me. This poor girl had anorexia, and in a desperate attempt to avoid eating but still getting rid of the evidence, she had been stuffing chewed-up food inside herself, internally. Meat, potatoes, you name it, rotting inside her body for weeks. She insisted she hadn't put anything in there. But unless there's a rare condition where potatoes just spontaneously grow in the human body, we weren't buying it. We had to remove what was basically a biohazard-level stew of rotting hospital food. Some of it was so decomposed, it was hard to tell where the food ended and the infected tissue began. She was immediately started on antibiotics and antifungals. Because, yeah, let me just say, by that point in school, we'd all seen and smelled some horrific stuff. Trauma cases, autopsies, even infected wounds. But this was next level. Half the room gagged. A few actually threw up. It was like death itself had a subscription to a meal plan. The worst part wasn't the smell, though. It was the heartbreaking reality of how far gone someone's mental health has to be for this to even happen. Felt so sorry for her. Story 11. Woman comes into the ER with a backdoor plug with a tail sticking out. She initially said that she was dressing up for a kid's birthday party and that her costume was stuck and she couldn't take it off. I wanted to ask, well, how old was the kid, but I didn't want to embarrass her even more. Story 12. Maybe a little late, but here goes. A teenage boy came into the emergency department with his mother. I remember he was wearing a long coat and looked kind of glum. Turns out he'd ordered too much KFC and had a drumstick left. So what did he decide to do? That's right, he shoved it up where the sun doesn't shine. Now the back door wants what it wants and refused to give the chicken leg back. So after some unsuccessful manipulation, he did what any teenage boy would do in a situation with no easy solution. He called his mother. After she also failed to remove the chicken leg, it was determined that a visit to hospital was in order. I remember that after the receptionist took the details, she directed them to the waiting room and told them to sit over there, and with a perfectly straight face, the mom said, "I think we'll stand." Story 13. I worked at a hospital for about a year, and one night we had a female patient come into the ER. She was there because, well, she had a pencil stuck in her special area. Now we didn't even need to ask how it happened. It was pretty obvious what went down, but for some reason she felt compelled to explain herself. Her story? She had just gotten out of the shower and slipped, and when she fell, she somehow landed on a pencil that was conveniently just sitting there on the bathroom floor, perfectly positioned to, well, end up where it did. I've been working in healthcare for a while, and let me tell you, that explanation is one I'll never forget. It's been 15 years, and it still cracks me up. Story 14. I worked as a temp in the office at a medical facility for a while, helping out with paperwork alongside the nurses and doctors. It wasn't the patients' lies that were the funniest part. It was just how predictable their behavior was when it came to certain things. For example, it was a well-known fact that men would almost never follow up on something simple like a sprained ankle or a minor injury. And this is where it got interesting. If there was a problem with their dong, you could bet your bottom dollar they were coming back for follow-up visits. It didn't matter how minor the issue seemed, whether it was an infection, rash, or anything else down there. That's when they suddenly cared about follow-ups. I guess when it comes to their bits, men know the stakes are high. Let's face it, a happy dong is a happy life, and nothing is going to get in the way of that. Story 15. My aunt is a doctor, and usually pretty strict about her vow of silence. And one day, this old guy showed up with a carrot stuck in his a-hole. It's obviously awkward. So my aunt decided not to ask too many questions. But the dude was constantly like, how did this happen? And I swear to God, well, my aunt does that the guy kept asking if it might have been because he'd eaten carrot soup 2 days before. Story 16. There's a woman in my office who used to work in the ER back in Scotland, and she's got stories like the kind that stay with you. First up, a guy comes in claiming he fell on a cucumber. Classic move. But instead of just letting the ER team handle it, he tried to pull it out himself and snapped it off inside. So now it's not just embarrassing, it's surgical. Then there was a couple trying to spice things up. The guy decided to attempt what can only be described as a wrestling move, a flying leap off the dresser aiming to land directly inside his partner. Unfortunately, his aim was optimistic. He missed, and the result, a fractured member and an ER trip for both of them. But the one that takes the cake was a man the staff affectionately dubbed Mr. Citrus. He came in sheepishly after deciding it was a good idea to insert not one, not two, but three full-sized oranges up his back door. It was only after the third one that he realized maybe it was time to call it a day and a doctor. Sometimes the fruit bowl should just stay in the kitchen. Story 17. Dude number 1 says he accidentally sat on an inflated balloon and it went up his a-hole, tried to pop it with bamboo skewers, perforated his sigmoid several times, and wound up with a whopping abdominal infection. Dude number 2 liked to stick the inside of a Bic pen down the dong and jacket, ended up losing it, and it migrated to the bladder, claimed he was trying to clear an obstruction because he couldn't pee. Saw him 2 different times for this. Story 18. Got a few wild ones for this. 1. The Noom incidents. Guy walks into the ER, looking shifty, bundled up in a big coat, and insists on only speaking to a male nurse. Once in private, he reveals a small garden gnome lodged where the sun doesn't shine, hat first. He claimed it happened during a fall from a ladder while gardening, and somehow the gnome got involved, due laughter. We got it out, and he walked away with his pride mostly intact. But then, a few days later, another guy shows up. Same situation, same garden gnome. Turns out there seps a whole underground thing called an backdoor gnoming party. Yeah, apparently that SIP's a thing now. 2. The wine bottle disaster. This guy comes in looking like he's been through war. Same big coat, same quiet request for male staff only. Once we get to the root of the problem, he'd been experimenting with a wine bottle. Things escalated, suction got involved. And when he yanked it out, well, let's just say parts of him that should have stayed inside didn't. The only reason he wasn't screaming, he was tripping hard on acid. He likely would have passed out from the pain otherwise. 3. The forgotten rubber band. A married man came in complaining of a foul smell down there, and he wasn't exaggerating. After some careful questioning, it came out that he'd recently started seeing someone on the side, someone who introduced him to a bedroom trick involving a rubber band at the base of his member, supposed to enhance performance, but he forgot to take it off. The band had rolled up and cut off circulation, leading to a serious infection. By the time he got to us, he was suffering from something we politely referred to as trench situation. Unfortunately, the damage was permanent, and we had to remove the entire organ. His biggest concern, not the surgery. Please, Donistel, tell my wife. Story 19. Teenager comes in complaining that he can't pee. I take him to an examination room, and to my utter surprise, I see 2 iPhone earbuds sticking out of his little guy. His story was that he was sleeping unclothed while listening to music, and his earbuds must have fallen out, and while he was tossing and turning, they naturally worked their way into his manhood. Anyway, he ended up needing surgery because they'd knotted, and we were unable to remove them with the cystoscopy. Story 20. My cousin's an ER nurse, and she's seen some things. One guy came in claiming his girlfriend got a little adventurous, and his words playfully put a tennis ball back there. Fair enough. But when they did the x-ray, they found 4. Yep, not 1, not 2, 4 tennis balls. His story kind of fell apart after that. But the second one? Way worse. A different guy walked in, totally calm, and said he accidentally sat on a screwdriver. As in, it somehow went in and then just kept going. He claimed it got sucked in, and when he tried to get it out, he accidentally pushed it through the wrong direction. It ended up causing a serious internal injury. The wildest part, he was so chill about it that the staff didn't believe him at first, until they realized he was high on a combo of MDMA and mescaline. The man must have had nerves, or nerve endings of steel. Story 21. This one still cracks me up. A guy came into the ER wearing nothing but a long overcoat, trying really hard to act like everything was normal. The problem? He had a vacuum cleaner nozzle attached to his equipment. He tried to be discreet, but there was one major giveaway. He hadn't detached the actual vacuum, so behind him, rolling along the hospital floor, was the full Henry Hoover. For anyone not in the UK, it's a small vacuum cleaner with a giant cartoon smiley face painted on the front. Picture a man walking into an ER, coat flapping, vacuum trailing behind him like a loyal pet, grinning the whole way. I haven't been able to look at one the same since. Story 22. So about 6 months ago, I had a 16-year-old guy come in with a backdoor problem as his chief complaint. He told me that while cleaning his room before school, he somehow tripped and fell right on a can of shaving cream that had been sitting upright on his bed. Apparently, he ripped his underwear in the process, and it just... Now the best part, his mom was with him, and she was fully on board with the story. She completely believed that her son just happened to sit directly on the can, which just happened to be standing upright on his bed. I honestly couldn't believe it. I gave her a look, then looked at him, then back to her. And she was convincing herself that this totally made sense. Needless to say, we had to call in general surgery for help. When an object can't just be easily removed, that's when the specialists come in. But man, this story will stick with me. Story 23. Urologist here. Let me just say, people are out here getting creative in ways the human body did not sign off on. 1. Scissor situation. Guy comes in with his, you-know-what, stuck in the handles of a pair of scissors. It was so swollen we couldn't slide them off, even after trying for 30 minutes. Eventually, we had to bring out a Dremel tool and carefully cut the scissors off. His explanation? He fell asleep in his chair, completely unclothed, while doing arts and crafts, and somehow, during the night, the scissors just landed there, like some bizarre game of ring toss. 2. The butter knife incident. Another guy came in after having somehow inserted a butter knife internally. Not through the usual route either. It went in through the front and ended up in the back. He claimed he fell on it, but this same guy is practically irregular. He's shown up with everything from plastic spoons to rolled up tape lodged somewhere it shouldn't be. 3. The overconfident teen. The last one was a teenager who found his dad's prescription for a very strong injectable medication used for certain performance issues. He took it upon himself to try it, at around 10x the recommended dose, because he was really into his video. He showed up with a very prolonged problem. We're talking over 8 hours. His situation was turning dangerous fast. It was swollen, darkening, and heading toward permanent damage. We just barely saved things with emergency surgery. He'll likely need a prosthetic in the future. We only figured out the dose because his dad found the empty vial and came clean. Story 24. Not a doctor, but a friend of mine worked overnight reception in the ER, and this story is too good not to share. One night, a college guy hobbles in with 2 of his frat bros. His lower half is wrapped in a bedsheet like a toga gone wrong, and he's clearly in pain, couldn't sit, could barely walk. Eventually, they get him into a room and figure out what happened. This genius had made a drunken bet that he could lift a 5-pound barbell weight using just, well, himself. His method? He slid his junk through the center hole of the weight, planning to get aroused and then lift it. Problem was, what went through soft didn't want to come back out hard. He ended up stuck, with the weight acting like an extremely unfortunate clamp. They tried everything: ice, elevation, probably prayers, but nothing worked. In the end, they had to cut the weight off like a metal puzzle, gone horribly wrong. Honestly, that was probably the only time in his life he wished he had whiskey performance. Story 25. This one sips pretty classic. A guy comes into the ER with serious internal injuries. The diagnosis: perforated intestines. But according to my friend, a med student at the time, perforated was putting it mildly. It was less of a hole and more like a disaster zone. When asked what happened, the patient gave the old classic, "I was cleaning, unclothed, and I fell on the broom handle." Now, nobody really bought that story, especially since the injury didn't exactly line up with a casual accident. But hey, points for commitment. The staff didn't make a big deal out of it, but from that day forward, He earned a new nickname around the hospital. Broom closet. Story 26. Aside from the usual parade of men showing up with mystery household objects lodged where they really shouldn't be, all while swearing, "Please don't tell my wife, I'm totally straight," one of the most unforgettable moments came from a woman. She walked into the ER, complaining of pelvic pain. That meant she was getting a pelvic exam, pretty routine. The doctor starts the exam. I'm the assisting nurse, and everything's going normally until suddenly the doc pauses and says, "Nurse, can I get a specimen cup?" I hand one over, and the doctor turns to the patient and casually asks, "Have you inserted anything recently? I kept seeing some odd-colored discharge and these little pebble-like objects." Without missing a beat, the patient says, "Oh, those? Yeah, those are just Skittles. I've been putting them in there. My boyfriend likes the taste." Yes, Sept, no. Sept tastes the rainbow. Septs. Turns out she'd been doing this for a week straight and had no idea that turning herself into a human vending machine was the reason she was so uncomfortable. Story 27. Worked in the ER for 8 years, and while a lot of things blur together, there's one story I'll never forget, purely because of the sheer confidence of the patient. A guy comes in and says he fell. That's all. Just a fall. But when we asked him to sit down, he very clearly could not. So we dig deeper. Turns out he had been changing a light bulb in his closet, completely unclothed of course, when he allegedly slipped off the ladder and landed directly onto something. That something? The aluminum tube of a two-piece vacuum cleaner. Now that SEP's already a wild coincidence. But it gets better. The tube just happened to be standing upright and just happened to be covered with, wait for it, 2 tube socks and a latex contraceptive covering. You know, to keep the dust out, real practical. Despite everything pointing in a very different direction, this guy never broke from his story, not once. He stuck to the changing the light bulb while unclosed tale with Oscar-level commitment. The x-ray looked like a sword had been swallowed the wrong way. One straight, glowing line running deep into his pelvis. The thing was in there. He ended up going to surgery to have it removed. Hopefully also picked up a lesson on proper lighting maintenance attire. Story 28. Made an account just to share this wild one. First post. A friend of mine used to work in the ER in Flagstaff, Arizona, and one day he told me a story that honestly still haunts me. A woman walks in, dressed like she just got off work at a bank. Total business professional vibe. She complains of abdominal pain and everything seems pretty normal until the exam starts. The doctor begins a pelvic exam and quickly notices something strange. Her V area was actually safety pinned shut. The doctor, trying to keep things professional, gently asks, "Would it be okay if I remove these?" She just says, "Sure, like it's no big deal." What happened next was straight out of a horror movie. The doctor removes the pins, and suddenly, a horrible smell fills the room, followed by black slurry and, wait for it, chicken bones and meat. Yep, actual spoiled food. When asked what on earth was going on, she calmly explained that she was trying to get pregnant and had heard somewhere that putting a raw chicken in there would help. No panic, no embarrassment, just casual, like she was explaining a new skincare routine. They immediately admitted her for psychiatric care. According to my friend, the most unsettling part wasn't even what she did, it was how completely normal she seemed while talking about it. Story 29. Not a medical professional exactly, but I used to work at a mental health facility with outpatients, and let me tell you, we saw some unforgettable stuff. There was this guy we'll call Dave. Really sweet when he was stable, super easy to talk to, but he had severe schizophrenia and often self-medicated, meaning he'd take only part of his prescribed meds or skip them entirely. Add in the fact that he was homeless and hard to track down, and yeah, it could get intense. One day, Dave shows up in full panic mode. He's agitated, pacing, and loudly insisting that he needs an MRI immediately. Says something's really wrong. It's urgent. Staff starts gathering around, because when Dave gets like this, it can go south fast. Now, we all know Dave has a history of self-harm, so nobody is about to put him into a machine that's basically a giant magnet without a full workup first. Good thing we did instead. They sent him for an x-ray first and found that Dave had inserted multiple sewing needles into his dong. Yeah, He had essentially turned himself into a walking hardware hazard and had planned to hop into an MRI, which would have been a disaster. Thankfully, the staff caught it in time, but the thought of what could have happened still haunts me. Story 30. This one was quick to figure out, literally. A teenage boy came into the ER in serious pain, unable to walk properly and clearly too embarrassed to speak. After some delicate questioning, we finally got the story. He was in the bathroom having a little solo moment when someone suddenly opened the door, panicked. He zipped up his pants in a hurry. Except he zipped up his sensitive skin. Caught it, right in the metal zipper, all the way in. It took us nearly 2 hours in the ER to figure out how to carefully get the zipper undone with a pair of pliers. The zipper was toast, but that was the least of his concerns. We numbed the area with a needle full of lidocaine, gently cleaned the wound, and bandaged him up. The best part? Right before he left, the nurse, trying not to laugh, gave him a little advice. Next time you spending quality time with yourself, maybe make sure the door is locked. Given how traumatized he looked, I have zero doubt he'll remember that moment for the rest of his life. Still wonder how he explained that ER visit to his parents. Story 31. This one's from my girlfriend, who was still a student nurse at the time and got thrown straight into the deep end. A man came into the ER with severe abdominal pain. Classic case. He was sweating, clearly in distress, and couldn't sit still, so they ran some x-rays. What showed up on the scan? A Barbie doll. Fully inside him, with the arms spread out like a starfish, which, if you're wondering, is exactly the worst-case scenario for removal. So she sent in to break the news. Still just a student, mind you. She gently tells the man, "The cause of your pain is a Barbie doll lodged in your lower intestines. You need surgery." The guy immediately goes into denial. "No way. That sip's impossible. I don't know how that got there." She pauses, looks him dead in the eye and says, "Do you really want your cause of death to be internal intestinal trauma due to Barbie doll inserted via the back door?" Suddenly, he got a lot quieter. Surgery was successful. Story 32. This one's a bit unusual, but it's definitely memorable. So during my clinical rotation in the military, I was working the graveyard shift, and I honestly knew very little about medicine at that point. It was a quiet night when a woman, probably in her early 20s, came in at around 10 p.m. She calmly told us her husband was in the car and needed help. Naturally, I was curious and went out with the nurse of the day, No D, to check it out. When we got to the car, there was an elderly gentleman sitting in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. The NOD knocked on the window, and he cracked it open about an inch. She asked if he was okay and if he was bleeding, but he said no. She then asked him to open the door so she could check him out, but he didn't respond. The NOD had to go back to the wife to get the keys, and after a moment the door unlocked. As she opened it, I noticed a soft buzzing sound that took me a second to process. Once I realized what it was, I rushed inside to get a wheelchair and cleared the ER. The elderly gentleman, who turned out to be a retired general, had gotten a toy stuck. Yep, he needed surgery to have it removed. The man barely spoke the entire time he was there. Maybe said 20 words, but honestly, I think I'd do the same thing. Pretty sure he was just trying to avoid the embarrassment, and I can't blame him. Story 33. This one is definitely a memorable one, though it's not my personal experience. I heard this from a friend who worked at a small hospital in Montana. It's his favorite story to tell, and it's a real head-scratcher. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon in the ER, perfect weather, just the right kind of day. Everything was calm until a couple walked through the parking lot and into the ER. The man was a lot older than the woman, and they were wrapped in a shared blanket, but not much else. As they got closer, it was clear the guy was in his 30s, and the girl was only 19. They rushed them into a room, and when they removed the blanket, well, let's just say, the man was stuck in the woman's back door, and I mean really stuck. Now, here's the wild part. The man explained that she had fallen into an anthill and was covered in ants. His solution? He threw her in the pool and jumped in to get the ants out. Somehow, they ended up in the situation they were in, and his theory was that the chlorine and the ant venom had caused it all. The woman, to my surprise, backed him up on the story, even though it was totally ridiculous. But then he realized that his story wasn't going to hold up, especially with this wife on the way. He was told that things would only get worse for him if he didn't get himself out of the situation before his wife arrived. So he finally relented. It turns out, the real reason was a bit more awkward. The girl wanted to try something new, but things weren't going as planned. The guy didn't want to use his wife's lube, so he decided to use hemorrhoid cream instead. Bad idea. It made things much tighter than expected, and the situation escalated quickly from there. But I'll never forget my friend trying to keep a straight face as he told me the story. Definitely one of those you can't make this stuff up situations. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.